studio audience can also use our Snapchat geofilter if you're on Snapchat. So 6 months ago today, on December 14th, 2017, the FCC issued a controversial vote repealing the 2015 Open Internet Order, which was a 2015 Obama-era regulation that is more colloquially known as Net Neutrality. Then this Monday, the Restoring Internet Freedom Order came into play. So right here next to me on stage tonight, we have the FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, a former antitrust attorney who came to the FCC promising to cut FCC regulation with a weed whacker and saying net neutrality's days were numbered. You can find him on Twitter at Ajit Pai. So let's start out with...
Or actually, Ajit Pai FCC.
Ajit Pai FCC, I'm sorry about that. Let's start out with the big question. The term net neutrality was first coined in 2003 by Professor Tim Wu. But in the last 15 years, it's been used in many different ways to describe many different things. Most recently, as we discussed, the 2015 Obama-era regulations, which many of the original net neutrality supporters didn't actually support. So when we talk about net neutrality, what is it we're talking about? Is it actually the end of the internet?
That's an important foundational question, and before I get to it, though, I want to thank you, Kat, and to thank Cato for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I very much value the advocacy that Cato has injected into our public discourse, in particular when it comes to communications issues. Thanks as well for being the first person in the 6 years that I've been at the FCC to pronounce my first name correctly. For all the South Indians out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think net neutrality is, I've called it one of the most seductive marketing slogans of all time, because it essentially means whatever you want it to mean. It's very difficult to argue against. Who could be against neutrality? It originally, long ago, over a decade ago, was meant to capture the notion that traffic over the last mile of networks, the time it takes to go from the hub to your house, that kind of bottleneck should be regulated. Over time, it's morphed into a notion of all traffic should be created equally, but everybody has their own notion of what it means. Ultimately, the question is one of government control. How do you think the government should regulate this online platform? That is essentially what the debate has been about. And the 2015 rules, I would argue, have nothing to do with net neutrality in the sense that it wasn't necessary to preserve a free and open internet. We had a free and open internet prior to 2015 under the framework that started under President Clinton in 1996.
Right, exactly. If this was going to end the internet, how come we didn't have internet before 2015?
Correctly, and I think that's part of the reason why a lot of the fear-mongering that took place lead up to the 2017 vote on December 14th was misplaced. On June 11th, these rules, the repeal of those rules went into effect. The internet still works, presumably. People are tweeting, posting on Instagram, Snapchat, and the rest. And so I think going forward, I think people will recognize that the free and open internet is something that all of us cherish. These utility-style regulations that were imposed in the name of net neutrality are something else entirely.
So I think there's this idea that the internet was very neutral, but then in recent times, large ISPs and platforms like Google and Facebook have sort of gained control of the internet, and it's no longer this sort of even playing ground, and that's why these rules need to be imposed. Could you respond to that a little bit?
I think it's an interesting question. It's one that a number of different agencies in the executive branch are wrestling with, as well as members of Congress. And some of the recent revelations about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook are raising these issues in the context of privacy and the like. The size of these platforms, the control they have, and how they monetize people's personal information and the like. From my perspective, I view it in two different ways. First and foremost is the FCC's role. Our role is primarily to make sure that the infrastructure is there, to extend what I call digital opportunity to all Americans. And that involves setting the regulatory framework that is necessary for everybody to get access to the internet and to promote more competition. Ultimately, I'm confident that is consumers' number one concern about the internet. It's not that their internet service provider has been blocking access to lawful content. It's that they don't have access at all, or there's insufficient competition. I hear that all the time. I only have one ISP to choose from. And so my argument to them is, well, let's work together. Here are some of the FCC's initiatives, designed to address that problem. But the second question is with respect to the dominance of certain platforms,
right.
Whether it's the network or content providers like Google and Facebook and the like. And then the question, I think, more for the antitrust and competition authorities at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, respectively. If a particular market for a product or service is concentrated, then well, let's have a conversation about that. But it seems to me preemptive regulation of the FCC of every single company in the internet economy, whether it's a big company that we all know or a small company like Paladin Wireless in Royston, Georgia. They don't seem like an anti-competitive monopolist to me that has market dominance vis-a-vis Google, but that's just me, I suppose.
And then, well, and that's true. A lot of the smaller ISPs are the ones who are opposing the 2015 rule.
Absolutely. And these are the companies that are critical to providing access in rural areas where the business case is hard enough as it is to build out these networks, and providing more competition, especially in urban areas. I visited a company called Rocket Fiber in Detroit. They were dissatisfied with the service that was being provided by some of the bigger players, and they decided to build their own fiber network to compete with the big guys. But what they found was that they had a lot of regulatory roadblocks, getting access to the utility poles in parts of Detroit, getting access to the conduit, the pipes that were under the ground. That was really hard for them. So those are the regulatory barriers that were standing in their way. And additionally, these heavy-handed regulations that were designed in 1934 to regulate Bell were an ill fit for that kind of company. They're struggling to raise the capital and build a case for deployment. And treating them as if they were the dominant monopolist just doesn't make a lot of sense.
This is actually one of the things that really interests me about the way in which net neutrality as a concept has changed over time, where in 2015 all of a sudden we see this idea that we're going to take the internet and we're going to make it into a...
Think about the utilities that are involved in your life. How innovative are they? How fast moving are they? How often do they introduce new products and services? I mean, have you ever said to yourself, man, my water company just came out with a killer product in 2017. My electric company is delivering ever more electricity. And the thing I argue, in addition to that, the fact that these are slow-moving utilities, and we don't want the internet to operate like your DMV. In addition to that, the internet is not a utility in the sense that its use is not generally static over time. I mean, year over year, we consume roughly the same amount of water, the same amount of electricity, and the like. Internet traffic is going up like this exponentially, and it's only going to increase even further once we, now that we're in the dawn of the Internet of Things. Once we get more,
internet, everything's online.
Exactly, 5G,
streaming.
Absolutely, with dawn of 5G, wireless connectivity, we're talking about virtual and augmented reality, industrial IoT applications and the like, and it's going to go up tremendously. You can't have all that increased internet traffic without networks to carry that traffic. You want smart networks, not dumb pipes, and the only way to do that is to have a regulatory framework that is more market-based, that recognizes that companies don't have to raise capital, they don't have to hire teams to build these networks, and consumers don't have to be served with internet access, and so we need to recognize
And
that.
that's because you're moving away from the fiber model to a more satellite model with the 5G?
To me, we're technologically neutral, so technological
pathways for it.
Absolutely, so if you look at all of our different programs, no one pays attention to this, but we have a multi-billion-dollar program that Congress has told us to institute called the Universal Service Fund. Under my leadership, we've opened that up to competition, not just from the small rural telephone companies, but from electric utilities and cable companies and satellite companies and wireless and others. We want all of them to compete to provide more internet access and competition. Ultimately, the government shouldn't put its thumb on the scale in favor of one technology or sector of the economy. We should open it up to competition. That's the best way to ensure that consumers are vindicated in terms of what they're concerned about in the internet.
Absolutely. So on that note, let's discuss your new rule that came into
Sure.
effect on Monday, the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. So that essentially moved ISPs, or Internet Service Providers, from Title II regulations, where they're being regulated as utilities, under the FCC, to being regulated under Title I, where they're regulated as information providers under, I believe, the Federal Trade Commission.
Correct.
Can you explain that a little bit and how that works?
Sure. So this is consistent with the regulations that apply to the internet from 1996, starting under President Clinton's time, all the way through the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and the first 6 years of the Obama administration. And under that framework, internet service providers were considered information service providers. And so we had a more light touch approach, so to speak. We didn't impose these utility-style regulations on them. We took targeted action against any anti-competitive conduct that we saw in the marketplace, and otherwise let the market develop organically. Title II is very different. It was designed, as I said, in 1934 to regulate utilities, and it involves rate regulation and other regulatory requirements that are much more onerous. And so we've returned to the light touch framework that served us pretty well for 20 years. It gave us $1.5 trillion in network investment.
Right.
Companies like Facebook and Amazon and Netflix and Google under this framework grew from small startups to global giants, and consumers are benefiting in unparalleled ways. I mean, I know it's hard to remember because we live in the day-to-day, but 22 years ago, when this light touch framework was adopted, we were talking about AOL CD-ROMs being sent in the mail. That modem with that little screech, you know, those of a certain age can remember it. And, you know, the killer application was email. And now we're talking about gigabit fiber and other advanced applications that were inconceivable a generation ago. That's because the United States, uniquely, I would argue, decided to take a very proactive, forward-thinking view of regulation. We were not going to regulate this like the water company or the electric company. The results of that speak for themselves, and so going forward, consumers are going to be protected under our new framework. Number one, at the FCC, we have a robust transparency rule. Every single internet service provider, they have to disclose various business practices to inform consumers and startups alike about what these practices are. And number two, at the Federal Trade Commission, we've now empowered the Federal Trade Commission once again to take action against any anti-competitive conduct. Recently, Joe Simons, the new chairman of the FTC, testified alongside me before the Senate, and he said we will take aggressive action if we see any unfair or deceptive trade practice, which is the FTC's bailiwick, that we find. That's really broad authority, and historically the FTC has been a great cop on the beat. Going forward, they will be as well, as will we.
Absolutely. So let's go back to that transparency rule a little bit. So this transparency rule, I believe, is something you pushed through yourself as part of not you, but as part of your tenure, right? Yeah. And it seems to me as if that transparency is actually a big part of the reason why this debate is so huge, where previous rulemaking processes haven't gotten as much attention. Do you think that that's true?
I think it is. I mean, I think back in 2015 when these the original rules were promulgated, one of the concerns I expressed is, look, this is at the time it was a 337-page plan, and my predecessor didn't allow the public to see it. And it seems to me if this is affecting a major component of the economy or the internet, everyone should be able to see what is in the details. Only weeks after the FCC actually voted in 2015 were you, the American public, allowed to see what was in the text of the order. This time it was different. 3 weeks in advance of the FCC's vote, I published for everyone to see, along with an op-ed describing this order, what the order was all about. You may like it, you may hate it, but at least you were able to see what it was that we were doing. And so we had a much more open and transparent process. And I've done that for all of our major initiatives. Every month by law, the FCC is supposed to have a vote on different proposals and orders that are set by the chairman. For the first time in 83 years at the time, when I came into office in my second week, I said, we're going to publish all of these things well in advance of the vote so everyone can see what it is we're doing.
Yeah.
To me, that's just a matter of good government. I think most people would be shocked to think that an agency that regulates 1/6 of the overall economy votes first and lets the public know what they're doing afterward.
Absolutely. Do you think that, have you gotten that kind of response on anything else that you voted on, or has it been really focused on the net neutrality?
I think it's been very positive overall. I mean, there are a lot of, the FCC, net neutrality is sort of a unique issue, but the bread and butter work that we do is very much in the weeds. It's, how does 47 CFR Part 32.606 affect our, regulate our business models and that kind of thing. So people really need to know in advance what it is you're proposing to do, because otherwise they can't give you meaningful feedback on it. And so before I instituted these reforms, back before I became chairman, we would have these weird meetings where parties would come in and say, well, we're really concerned or we're really happy with what we think the FCC might be doing, but we can't really tell you why. And so now going forward, on things like telemedicine, we just got a third vote, for example, on my proposal to improve the rural healthcare program that we have that provides subsidies to get telemedicine in rural areas. And that's something I think has bipartisan support across the board. Our rural broadband efforts have been tremendous. Same thing with getting spectrum into the marketplace to allow the U.S. to maintain leadership at 5G. And these are the kinds of things that I think have broad bipartisan support, and I think are being open with the public about what it is we're doing as a part of that.
Absolutely. But as you mentioned, a lot of this work really is in the weeds, and honestly, I think net neutrality is as well.
It is.
Absolutely. It's a little strange that we've had so many people in the public care so passionately about what is really just a regulatory rule.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, celebrities seem to have played a pretty big role in this debate. I think a lot of Americans learned about net neutrality from John Oliver.
Yes.
We've all seen the video.
Going after my mug, that was, I mean, take shots, whatever shots you want to take at me, the mug is an innocent party, it's sort of collateral damage in this whole debate.
Great, Mark Ruffalo.
Yes, yeah.
Better known perhaps as the Incredible Hulk from...
Before you slip there, I think,
he tweeted that taking away net neutrality is the authoritarian dream. I'm sure he's, of course, very adept in tech regulation.
Well, so, I mean, I know if there's one thing you know about authoritarians, they love deregulation and getting the government power.
Yeah, so how do you think that sort of like celebrity push behind this has impacted the conversation?
Obviously, the usual caveat, they have the right to say whatever they want to say, it's part of the public discourse,
Of course, yeah.
But, on the other hand, injecting that kind of misinformation into the debate is not helpful at all. I mean, a lot of these folks were proclaiming our proposed decision, the end of the internet as we know it. And I cannot tell you how many times I've heard that. Am I really going to have to pay $5 to be able to tweet? Is the internet really going to end on June 11th? All these tweets, with one word per line. This is how the internet's going to work. It's like,
yeah, are you going to have to pay for every individual website you load?
Absolutely, yes. And there's only so much debunking that can happen. The Washington Post fact checker gave that one word per line tweet 3 Pinocchios. And, people just debunk the whole Portugal analogy. Portugal has net neutrality regulations. This has nothing to do with that, the bundled package that people were worried about. Obviously, judging from my own Twitter feed and the response I get to it, people are not paying $5 per tweet because I can assure you it's a little more judicious in actually costing them money. And so I think a lot of the debate, unfortunately, and not limited to the celebrities, but including them, has just been focused on something other than the facts. And I think the fact that a lot of people were proclaiming this the end of the internet. In fact, I had anticipation you might ask that question. So this is actually one of the fundraising pitches that has been going out from one of the groups that's been centrally involved in this. So they talked about
this week, right?
This week, and someone helpfully signed me up for spam lists. And so it says, talking about how net neutrality is the end of the world, life is going to end, Ajit is evil, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the PS is the best part. Don't panic. The internet isn't going to come to a crashing halt today, but this is still really serious. Want to help us win the fight ahead? Chip in $5 now. And so, to me, they're not interested in finding a solution to the problem that we all agree on, which is the lack of access in some areas or insufficient competition. They're focused on using this as a political cudgel. And look, I get that. I mean, this is all public policy debates are about, arguing about political positions and the like, but to me at least, this shouldn't be a political issue. This wasn't a political issue when Chairman Hunt and Chairman Kennard were wrestling with these problems in the Clinton administration. This was not a political issue for many, many years, and so I'm hopeful that this bipartisan tradition of figuring out the right way to calibrate our regulation is something that will return, and that hoping against hope anyway, that rational discourse will prevail.
This has been more than just a political issue for you. This has been a deeply personal issue. After the repeal vote in December, you received hundreds of thousands of emails, hate mail. You had folks picketing your house. Your family was targeted. You had death threats. You had to cancel public appearances. I believe you were called Hitler. I think, do you really want to be the man who's responsible for making America North Korea? Do you really want to be the man responsible for making America North Korea?
Is that real?
Oh yeah. I looked him up. There's some really terrible things here. A lot of them were very racist. There's a lot of racist memes. Several people saying you should be deported.
Back to Buffalo, New York, bro. I love Buffalo, but
Right, this is all about a regulation. Again, this is not something, you're not going out doing some horrible thing. At least I don't think so. I mean, how do you respond to that? Why do you think that you got this kind of response?
I think part of it is that we have an overall toxic political environment, that we live at a time when politics is essentially tribal, and depending on the partisan affiliation that one happens to hold, people are going to react to that positively or negatively. I think part of it is also that a lot of people rely on the internet increasingly in their lives, and so when they hear on a very high level that's going to end, they become very concerned about that. Naturally, and I would too if the internet was indeed going to end, but it's not, of course. Part of it is also, frankly, politicians grandstanding. I mean, a number of different elected officials have called us un-American or evil. And I'm old enough to remember when rhetoric like that was considered un-American and evil. In addition to groups essentially just fundraising off it or using it to gain political advantage. And to me, at least, that's not the work of the FCC. We are not actually a political agency in that sense. We're an independent agency precisely because we've been entrusted by Congress for over 8 decades the responsibility of determining the right regulatory framework to ensure that all Americans have access to communications services. It's a pretty simple mission. And so, I get it, but on the other hand, I have to say that it's not very pleasant to see anybody in public life, especially myself, in my speaking crassly.
I was insulted by some of the comments I saw, to be honest. So
yeah, it's just not. I don't care what part of the government you serve in or what party you belong to. No one should have to face this stuff. And we're all Americans at the end of the day. It's a pretty steep slope from where we have been historically as a country that might disagree about politics, but at the end of the day still call themselves being part of the same team, to a country where we're essentially at civil war with each other when it comes to public policy debates. I really hope that this is not a harbinger of that, because if it is, it's not just me that's going to suffer, it's going to be the entire country. That's not what it means to be an American to me.
not at all, not at all. But I think that on that point about the political, we're an increasingly politicized society, and we start looking at this regulation, in 2015, a Democrat-led FCC passed the Open Internet Order. 2017, a Republican-led FCC passed the Restoring Internet Freedom Act. These things are, within 2 years, almost directly oppositional to each other. And I mean, how do we know that there's not going to be in another couple of years another FCC order that's reversing the rule again?
That's a good point, and that's precisely why back in 2014, when the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit rendered its second decision invalidating the FCC's previous rules, I put out a statement in which I said, look, the court clearly said that the FCC's decision-making here is legally flawed. The correct solution is to turn to Congress, have Congress update the rules of the road to match the digital era. The last time Congress pronounced judgment on these issues was 1996, 22 years ago. I think the right solution here is for Congress.
The internet's changed a little since then.
A tiny bit. I mean, as much as we love Lycos and Alta Vista and all the rest, we've moved on a little bit since then. And so I think it would be great if Congress would simply put on the page what I think everybody agrees on. I mean, nobody wants blocking of access to lawful traffic. No one wants throttling, anti-competitive arrangements, and the like. We actually all agree on the important values that undergird free and open internet. What we might not agree on is utility-style regulation under Title II. So let's let Congress just put on the page, this is what we want the rules to be, this is what we want the FCC to do, and then we can move on to the areas where I think everybody would agree on. Let's just get more internet access out there and more competition. Empower every American to take charge of his or her digital future.
Absolutely, and I think actually your repeal vote did end up kind of spurring some sort of legislative action on this. Senate Democrats have been pushing for net neutrality regulations.
Right. Through the Congressional Review Act, and now elected officials will have to make a decision. They ultimately, if reason will prevail, and we'll be able to restore this light touch approach that we've had and served us so well for many years.
I hope so as well. But what about the, I believe a couple states tried to pursue their own net neutrality programs. California, was it Oregon?
Yeah, a number of different states.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's some question about whether or not that's legal. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So it has been a bedrock principle at the FCC for many, many years, well before I became chairman, that internet access is inherently an interstate service. If I send you an email right now, assuming the internet still works, that it would, chances are it would actually traverse state boundaries or district state boundaries. That is an interstate service, and so it follows from that principle that it should be regulated by the federal government. That's the standard law.
Right.
It also follows from that any state regulation or order that is in conflict with that overall federal deregulatory approach that we've adopted is preempted. That's what we said in the 2017 order that we just issued. And so it's going to be up to courts to figure out how to sort these things out. But going forward, I think what we don't want is a patchwork in which the federal government has one set of rules, any number of states have different rules, even localities, if they choose to get into this, that have a different bite of the regulatory apple. I think that's a recipe for chaos. It's better to have a single, consistent federal regulatory scheme.
So you've been perhaps somewhat ironically called the libertarian regulator. How does libertarian philosophy fit into your views on net neutrality or your work in the FCC at large?
It's not easy, given the moniker of being the Hitler of the 21st century, but being a libertarian. But yeah, exactly. But I think it does inform not just on this issue, but overall my approach to regulation. It seems to me the standard for regulation should always be what is the market failure that we are trying to address, and let's pick the most market-oriented way of solving that problem. Similarly, how are these regulations standing in the way of economic opportunity? And is there any way we can modernize our rules to make sure that we match the modern marketplace? A lot of the problems the FCC has had over the years, not necessarily in this area, but in many others, is that we are issuing regulations based on laws that were passed in 1934, or 1968, or 1992, or 1996. Those laws capture a snapshot of the marketplace in a moment in time, and that snapshot becomes pretty quickly yellowed with age, especially when we're talking about technologies like the internet. So how do we modernize our rules within that statutory framework? The more out of step our regulations become, the less likely it is that consumers are going to benefit from some of the technologies that will never see the light of day because of those regulations.
Right, there's a fantastic meme that goes around on the internet that I love because I did grow up in the dawn of the internet age with AOL and all of that. And when we were young, our parents told us never meet anyone off, never get in a stranger's car, never meet anyone from the internet.
Right.
Now, we literally use our phone to summon strangers from the internet to get in the car.
What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, it's a whole different world. There's no way that those fools could possibly predict this kind of environment.
Exactly.
So, to shift things off a little bit, one of your major focuses has been net neutrality, but you've said that that's a small part of a much larger plan for rural internet access. You mentioned that a little bit, but you've been on this major tour, I believe 26 states you've been to recently?
Yeah, now up to 28.
28, okay.
Yeah, plus the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands.
30. So tell us a little bit about that and how net neutrality is part of it.
Sure. So to me, our top priority is closing the digital divide, the gap between those who have access to the internet and those who don't. And part of the reason why I travel is to get a sense of what some of the promise of the digital era is in some of these communities. Places like Scottsville, Kentucky, where previously it was one of the lower income parts of Kentucky, part of Allen County, wasn't a single pediatrician in the entire county of Allen. But now, thanks to a broadband connection between Allen County schools and Nashville's Vanderbilt University's Children's Hospital, they now can do telemedicine. So people are healthier. Parents don't have to take time off work. They can monitor via an app how the remote visit with the school nurse is going and the like. It's pretty cool, and teachers can focus on teaching. That is that gives me a lot of hope about the future of some of these communities when they can get internet access. But I've also been to parts of the country that don't have it. I was at the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in Mission, South Dakota about a year ago. And I met with a tribe that told me the story of a woman who was found dead in her home. She was clutching her cell phone, and she dialed 911 38 times, but the call never went through because there wasn't wireless access. And so those are the kinds of gaps that we want to address. And I recognize that this issue in particular will consume